Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds out what he's truly made of. Cole Hawthorne learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Once the richest cattleman in the territory, he watched his empire crumble after a water feud turned deadly. His ranch was seized, his name dragged through mud, and at 63 years old, he disappeared into the unforgiving desert where nothing grows and nobody survives. A year later, whispers began drifting back to town. Cole was alive, somehow thriving in that godforsaken wasteland. What he'd built out there defied all reason and shook the conscience of every person who'd turned their back on him. But how does a broken man with nothing build a paradise from dust? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hawthorne Ranch had stood for 42 years as a monument to what hard work and shrewd business could accomplish in the Arizona territory. 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, fed by the Silver Creek that ran year-round through the western portion of the property. Cole Hawthorne had built it from nothing, starting with 200 head of cattle and a mortgage that would have broken most men's spirits before they cleared their first profit. But Cole wasn't most men. He'd arrived in Mesquite Flats in 1871 with calloused hands, a horse that had seen better days, and a reputation as someone who kept his word no matter the cost. That reputation meant everything in a place where a handshake still carried more weight than a dozen lawyers and their papers. By 1875, he'd quadrupled his herd. By 1880, he owned the largest cattle operation within 100 miles. By 1890, politicians came to him for advice, and banks considered his endorsement worth its weight in gold. The ranch house itself told the story of a man who'd prospered but never forgotten where he came from. It wasn't one of those ostentatious mansions some of the railroad barons were building up north. Cole had constructed it with local adobe and timber, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade during the brutal summer months and a place to watch the sunset year-round. His late wife Margaret had insisted on the wraparound porch. She'd passed 11 years ago, but Cole still took his coffee there every morning, sitting in the chair next to hers, talking to her about the day ahead like she might answer back. The interior remained much as Margaret had left it. Simple furniture built to last, none of the fancy imported pieces that some of the newer wealthy families favored. The exception was Margaret's piano, a beautiful upright that had cost Cole 3 months of profit to have shipped from San Francisco. She'd played it every evening, filling the house with melodies that somehow made the harsh desert outside seem gentler, more forgiving. After she died, Cole couldn't bring himself to touch it. The piano sat silent for 11 years, gathering dust that he carefully wiped away each week. Unable to part with it, but equally unable to make it sing again, Cole had one son, Thomas, who'd left for law school in Boston 20 years earlier and never returned except for brief, uncomfortable visits every few years. Thomas had grown ashamed of his father's rough edges, the dirt under his fingernails that never quite washed clean, the way Cole spoke plainly instead of dressing up his words in fancy language. The boy had wanted sophistication, culture, the kind of life that couldn't be found in a dusty Arizona cattle town. The distance between them had grown wider than the miles separating Arizona from Massachusetts. They exchanged letters twice a year, Christmas and Cole's birthday, each one more perfunctory and distant than the last, filled with polite inquiries that neither man truly cared to have answered. The ranch employed 17 men year-round, more during branding and roundup season. Miguel Santos had been Cole's foreman for 28 years, a friendship that ran deeper than business or even blood. They'd weathered droughts together, fought off rustlers side by side, buried good horses and better men. Miguel's family lived in a comfortable house on the eastern edge of the property, and his 3 sons all worked the ranch alongside their father, learning the business the way Miguel had learned it, through sweat and experience rather than books. Among the ranch hands, Cole was respected but not feared. He paid fair wages, provided decent housing in solid bunkhouses with real beds and stoves, and treated his men like human beings rather than expendable labor. When Juan Morales broke his leg in a riding accident 3 years back, Cole paid for the doctor and kept him on payroll during the 6 months of recovery, even though Juan couldn't work. When Samuel Fletcher's wife died in childbirth, Cole rode through a storm to fetch the midwife, though he arrived too late to save either mother or child. He paid for the funeral and stood in the rain at the graveside, hat in hand, while Samuel wept over the fresh-turned earth. This was the life Cole had built over 4 decades, solid, respected, meaningful, a legacy that should have passed to his son, though Thomas wanted no part of it. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with something as simple and essential as water. Silver Creek had fed both the Hawthorne Ranch and the smaller properties downstream for as long as anyone could remember. There'd never been a problem before, because there'd always been enough. The creek ran strong even in dry years, fed by springs deep in the mountains to the north, cold and clear and reliable as sunrise. But in the winter of 1912, a man named Vernon Blackwood arrived in Mesquite Flats with Eastern money and big plans that would change everything. Blackwood bought up 5 struggling farms downstream from Cole's property, consolidating them into a single large operation. He talked about irrigation, about scientific farming, about transforming the territory into an agricultural powerhouse that would rival California. Some folks were excited by his vision and his money, impressed by his Eastern education and confident manner. Others, like Miguel, were suspicious of anyone who used that many words to describe simple ranching. "A man who talks that much is usually trying to hide something," Miguel had said one evening over coffee, and Cole had nodded his agreement, though he'd tried to keep an open mind. Competition was healthy. New ideas could improve everyone's prospects. Blackwood wanted to dam Silver Creek, where it entered his property, creating a reservoir that would give him complete control over the water supply for his ambitious irrigation plans. Never mind that such a dam would reduce the water flowing to Cole's ranch by more than half. Never mind the written agreements, some of them decades old, that guaranteed water rights based on who'd been there first, who'd settled the land when it was still dangerous country full of Apache raiders and outlaws. Blackwood had something. Cole didn't. Political connections that reached all the way to the territorial governor's office. He had lawyers from back east who could argue that old handshake agreements meant nothing compared to modern legal documents with proper seals and signatures. He had money to bribe the right people and influence to sway public opinion through newspapers he quietly funded, printing editorials about progress and modernization that made Cole seem like an old-timer, standing in the way of the territory's bright future. The legal battle dragged on for 18 months, each month more exhausting than the last. Cole spent money he'd saved for emergencies, hiring lawyers who promised they could win, but never quite managed to. The Territorial Water Commission seemed determined to rule in Blackwood's favor, no matter how clear the historical record, no matter how many witnesses testified to the old agreements. Miguel joked grimly that justice seemed to flow toward money the same way water flowed downhill, and there wasn't much anyone could do about natural laws. The stress aged Cole visibly. The lines around his eyes deepened into crevasses. His hair, which had been mostly dark with distinguished streaks of gray, turned completely silver within 6 months, as if winter had settled permanently on his head. He stopped taking his morning coffee on the porch, stopped talking to Margaret's empty chair. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it brought dreams of the ranch withering under a merciless sun, his cattle dying of thirst, while Blackwood's reservoir glittered in the distance. Like a mirage made real and terrible, things came to a head on a scorching August afternoon in 1913. Blackwood's men had started construction on the dam without waiting for the final legal ruling, confident that the decision would go their way. Cole rode out with Miguel and 3 other hands to stop them, to at least slow them down until the commission made its ruling. Words were exchanged, harsh words that Cole later couldn't quite remember through the haze of anger and fear. Someone drew a gun first. Cole never knew who, never could piece together that crucial detail from the chaos that followed. What he did know was that when the dust settled and the gun smoke cleared, two of Blackwood's men lay dead in the dirt and one of his own ranch hands. Young Danny Foster, who was only 19 and had a sweetheart back in town, would never walk again. The territorial marshal arrested Cole on the spot, while Danny screamed in pain and Miguel tried to explain what had really happened. Blackwood's lawyers worked faster than rattlesnakes striking, painting Cole as a violent, unstable man who'd rather kill than accept progress. Never mind that witnesses, neutral witnesses who had nothing to gain from lying, said Blackwood's men had drawn first. Never mind that Cole had spent 40 years building a reputation for fairness and measured response, never once raising his hand in anger except when absolutely necessary. The trial was a travesty of justice. The judge had received a large campaign contribution from Blackwood just 3 months before. The jury included 3 men who owed Blackwood money and 2 others who worked for businesses that depended on Blackwood's goodwill. Cole's lawyers tried their best, but they were outmatched and outspent at every turn. The verdict came down guilty of manslaughter and criminal conspiracy. The sentence included time in territorial prison, but worse than that, far worse, the judge ruled that Cole's ranch would be seized to pay damages to the victims' families and to cover the legal costs that Blackwood had incurred defending his men's honor. Everything gone. 42 years of backbreaking work, of careful planning, of building something that would last beyond his own lifetime, taken away in an afternoon by a corrupt judge reading from a script Blackwood's lawyers had probably written for him. Miguel stood beside Cole as they read the verdict. His weathered face set like stone, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "This isn't right, Cole. Everybody knows it. Everybody with half a brain can see what happened here. Knowing it and doing something about it are 2 different things," Cole replied quietly. His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears, like he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. The town reacted in ways both predictable and deeply disappointing. Some people spoke out, calling the trial a sham and the verdict an injustice that shamed the entire territory. But most stayed silent, averting their eyes when Cole passed on the street, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere when he approached. Blackwood had power now, money, influence that reached into every corner of territorial politics. People had families to feed, businesses to protect, mortgages coming due. They couldn't afford to make an enemy of a man who seemed to have the entire territorial government in his pocket. Thomas sent a telegram from Boston. "Deeply sorry. Nothing I can do from here. Please understand my position." Cole understood perfectly. His son was embarrassed by the scandal, worried it might damage his budding legal career back east, afraid that association with a convicted criminal father would taint his carefully constructed, respectable life. The telegram was the last communication Cole ever received from him. Though he didn't know it at the time, Miguel and his sons offered to help Cole fight, to organize the ranch hands, to resist the seizure by any means necessary. Cole refused firmly. "I won't have any more blood on my hands," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made even Miguel step back. "Danny Foster is paralyzed because of me, because I couldn't let go of something that was already lost. 2 men are dead, leaving behind wives and children. I won't add to that count, not for anything. You didn't start this, Cole. You didn't want this. No, but I'm going to end it. My way, peacefully." On the day they came to take possession of the ranch, Cole packed a single saddlebag with clothes, some jerky, a canteen, and 1 item from the house. Margaret's silver locket with her picture inside, the image faded but still recognizable. He left everything else. The furniture they'd chosen together, the dishes she'd served Sunday dinners on, the piano he still couldn't bear to play, the lifetime of memories contained in those adobe walls. He saddled his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Copper, who'd been his companion for 8 years, and rode away without looking back, afraid that if he turned around, he might not have the strength to leave. Miguel ran after him on foot. his face etched with concern and something like fear. "Cole, where are you going?" "Away from here, old friend. Somewhere I can't hurt anybody else. Somewhere my choices can't destroy other people's lives. This is madness. You'll die out there in that desert. Nobody survives that country without supplies, without preparation." Cole managed a thin smile, the first expression beyond numbness that had crossed his face in days. Maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe that's justice that the court couldn't give. Don't talk like that. You're not. Goodbye, Miguel. Take care of your family. Take care of my boys, the ones who worked for me. They're good men. They deserve better than they got. He rode south into the desert that stretched for 50 miles before the nearest settlement. It was late September, still brutally hot during the day, though the nights brought some relief from the killing heat. Most people avoided that stretch of wasteland. There was no water, no shelter, nothing but sand and rock and scrub brush that somehow survived on nearly nothing. Tough and mean and unforgiving, it seemed like the perfect place for a man who'd become nothing himself. The desert didn't care about Cole Hawthorne's troubles. It didn't care that he'd lost everything or that his name had been dragged through every saloon and church social in the territory. The desert existed in its own time, operating by rules older than human ambition or greed or even justice. Out here, stripped of everything that had defined him for 4 decades, Cole discovered a strange kind of freedom in his complete and total irrelevance. The first week nearly killed him. He'd been a rancher, not a desert wanderer. He knew cattle, horses, business, the give and take of commerce and negotiation. But surviving alone in a landscape that offered nothing came down to different skills entirely. The water he'd brought lasted 3 days, rationed carefully, but still gone too quickly in the relentless heat. After that, he had to find more or die trying, and death seemed like the more likely outcome. Copper sensed water before Cole did. The horse's ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring to catch some scent invisible to human perception. Cole had learned long ago to trust an animal's instincts, especially in matters of survival. He gave Copper his head, let the gelding choose the path, and the horse picked his way between rocks and through narrow washes until they reached a spot where a thin trickle of water seeped from a crack in the stone. It wasn't much, barely enough to wet his bandana and let it drip into his mouth, but it was life itself. Pure and essential, Cole made camp near that seep, fashioning a crude shelter from dead mesquite branches and his bedroll. He had no plan beyond surviving the day, then the next day, then the one after that. The future had become something he no longer thought about, no longer dared to think about. For a man who'd spent his entire adult life planning months and years ahead, anticipating markets and weather patterns and 1,000 other variables, this strange day-to-day existence felt both terrifying and oddly peaceful. The nights were the hardest. The desert cold seeped into his bones, making him huddle close to a fire that he barely managed to keep burning with scarce fuel. But worse than the cold were the thoughts that came when he had nothing to distract him. He kept seeing Danny Foster's face as they carried him away, legs useless, his whole life changed in the space of a heartbeat. He kept hearing the gunshots, seeing the 2 men fall, knowing that even though he hadn't pulled the trigger himself, his choices had led to their deaths as surely as if he had. Margaret's voice came to him in those dark hours. Not literally. Cole wasn't losing his mind, at least he didn't think so, but he remembered things she'd said, wisdom she'd offered during their 26 years together. "Cole, you can't carry the whole world on your shoulders. Sometimes you have to set the burden down and trust that you did your best with what you knew at the time." Had he done his best? He tried to protect his ranch, his livelihood, the jobs of 17 men and their families. That seemed right at the time, seemed like the responsible thing to do. But 2 men were dead now, their families without husbands and fathers. Danny would never walk again, never dance with his sweetheart, never chase his own children around a yard. What kind of best was that? By the 2nd week, Cole had established a routine that kept him alive, if not exactly living. Dawn brought him awake. Old habits from ranch life died hard, no matter how much he wanted to sleep away his existence. He'd check on Copper, who was surviving on the tough desert grass that grew in scattered patches near the seep. Then he'd scout the area, learning the land the way he'd once learned every section of his ranch, noting landmarks and water signs and the subtle variations that meant the difference between life and death out here. He discovered a barrel cactus grove about a mile east, a potential source of water if the seep failed. He found tracks indicating javelina and desert bighorn, meaning there were other water sources nearby, probably more reliable than his little trickle. He set snares for rabbits using wire from his saddlebag, and after a week of failure, finally caught one, the meat tough and gamey, but better than slowly starving. He also found something else. The remains of old adobe structures so weathered and collapsed that they were barely recognizable as human constructions. Someone had tried to live out here once, long ago. The Spanish, perhaps, or maybe prospectors chasing silver dreams that never panned out. Whatever their story, whoever they'd been, they'd left behind scattered fragments of their attempt at civilization. Broken pottery with faded designs, a rusted iron pot with a hole in the bottom, a few hand-carved stones that might have been part of a building, foundation or maybe grave. Marcus. Cole sat among these ruins one evening, as the sun set in colors that would have seemed impossible anywhere else, oranges and purples and reds that painted the sky like some vast canvas. He felt an unexpected kinship with whoever had tried and failed here. They'd built something in this impossible place, and the desert had reclaimed it, scattered it, reduced it to fragments that future wanderers might puzzle over. Just like the desert would eventually reclaim any trace of his own existence. There was something humbling about that, something that made his personal losses feel smaller in the scope of time's vast indifference. The third week brought an unexpected visitor that would change Cole's trajectory. Cole was checking his snares. He'd caught another rabbit, which meant he'd eat tonight when he heard hoofbeats approaching. His first instinct was to hide, but he dismissed it. He had nothing worth stealing anymore, and frankly, he wasn't sure he cared what happened to him. He stood in plain sight as a young man rode up on a horse that had clearly seen better days, and probably wouldn't see many more. The rider couldn't have been more than 20 at most, real thin, with eyes that had seen too much too young, that particular haunted look that came from violence witnessed or perpetrated or both. He pulled up 20 feet away, hand resting on a pistol that looked too big for his narrow frame. "You're Cole Hawthorne," the kid said. "Not a question but a statement, sure of himself despite his youth." "I was," Cole said. His voice sounded rusty from weeks of disuse, like an old gate hinge that needed oil. "I heard about what happened. My pa said you got a raw deal. Said that whole trial was rigged from the start. Your pa was generous in his assessment." The kid studied him for a long moment, seeming to measure something, then reached some internal decision. "Name's Billy Carson. I'm headed south, away from some trouble of my own. Was told there's nothing out this way but death. But figured death was better than what I was leaving behind. Probably good information about the death part. You're still alive, though. Give it time. The desert's patient. It'll get me eventually." Billy dismounted, moving with the careful wariness of someone used to being attacked, to having to fight or run without warning. "I got some salt pork and cornmeal." "You got water?" "A little. Not much, but enough to share. Seems like we might help each other then, at least for a spell." They shared a meal that evening, the first food Cole hadn't had to catch or kill himself in 3 weeks. Billy didn't say much about his trouble, and Cole didn't ask. Out here, a man's past seemed less important than whether he'd share his provisions and watch the horizon while you slept. The two men who'd left Mesquite Flats that August afternoon seemed very far away, like they'd happened to someone else in another life. Billy stayed 2 days, helping Cole improve his shelter and his snares, sharing what he knew about desert survival. Before he left, he looked at Cole's seep with an experienced eye, then knelt down to examine the rock formation. "This could be made better," Billy said. "My grandpa was a well digger back in Texas. Taught me some things before he died. I recognize the signs here. There's probably a good spring underneath if you dig down proper, maybe 6 or 8 feet. Could give you real water, enough to do more than just survive." After Billy left, riding south toward Mexico and whatever future awaited him there, Cole found himself thinking about that comment. A proper spring would make this location genuinely habitable rather than barely survivable. It was the first time since leaving the ranch that he'd thought beyond simple day-to-day existence. The first time he'd considered doing something other than waiting to die. That night, he pulled out Margaret's locket and opened it by firelight. Her face looked back at him, forever young in that photograph, forever smiling that gentle smile that had first drawn him to her all those years ago at a church social in town. "What do you think, Maggie? Do I stay out here and dig a well, or do I just keep drifting until there's nothing left to drift toward?" The answer came not from the locket, but from somewhere deeper inside himself, some part that hadn't died with his reputation and his ranch. Margaret had always been the practical one, the person who saw possibility where others saw obstacles. She'd believed in building things, creating homes and lives that mattered, finding meaning in the work itself rather than in what it might bring. Giving up wasn't in her nature, and maybe it didn't have to be in his either. The next morning, Cole began surveying the area around the seep more carefully, more thoughtfully. Billy had been right. There were signs, if you knew what to look for. The rock formation suggested water flowing underground, pooling in places, seeking the surface through cracks and fissures. With the right tools and enough determination, he might be able to dig down and find a reliable source that would transform this place from death trap to sanctuary. But tools required supplies, and supplies required money, and money was something Cole Hawthorne no longer possessed. Or did he? He remembered something from his early days, before the ranch, before Margaret, before he'd become respectable and settled and successful. He'd been a young man then, barely 20, working odd jobs and prospecting a little, learning how to survive on nothing but determination and whatever he could find or make. He'd developed skills he hadn't needed in decades, how to make tools from scrap metal, how to build with whatever materials were at hand, how to ask the land for what he needed rather than demanding it provide. Those skills were still there, buried under 40 years of prosperity, but not forgotten, not completely lost. Cole walked through the ruins again, this time not with sadness, but with an assessor's eye, a builder's practical evaluation. The collapsed adobe walls could be salvaged, their materials reused. The technique for making adobe bricks was simple: mud mixed with straw and shaped in wooden forms, then left to bake in the relentless sun. The desert had plenty of mud near the seep, where water softened the ground, and scattered dried grass could serve as straw if he gathered enough. He'd need wooden forms to shape the bricks, but he could fashion those from the old mesquite and palo verde that grew in the washes, dead wood that would serve his purpose. It would be hard work. Brutal work for a 63-year-old man who'd grown accustomed to having others do the heavy lifting, while he managed from horseback or from behind a desk. But Cole discovered something surprising. He didn't mind the prospect. In fact, the idea of building something with his own hands, answering to no one, dependent on no one's approval or judgment, felt more appealing than anything had in months, maybe in years. He spent the 4th week gathering materials and planning, letting his mind work the way it used to when he'd first started the ranch, with nothing but 200 head of cattle and a dream of something better. The old rancher's mind that had built an empire now turned toward something smaller, but somehow more essential, creating a place where he could simply exist without owing anyone anything or having anyone depend on him for their survival. On the first day of the 5th week, exactly 1 month after leaving his ranch, Cole Hawthorne began digging his well. He used a sharp rock and a broken piece of iron from the ruins. Crude tools, but effective enough if you were patient and persistent. He dug in the spot where the seep was strongest, following the moisture down into the earth. His back ached after the first hour. His hands blistered and bled after the first day. Every shovelful of rocky soil felt like it might be his last, his aging body protesting this brutal treatment, but he kept digging, working through the pain. Because somehow, out here in the middle of nowhere, he'd found something he'd lost in all those years of Success and responsibility and careful planning, a reason to wake up in the morning that had nothing to do with money or reputation or anyone's expectations but his own. He'd found purpose in the simplest possible form, survival. Not just surviving, but building. Creating something from nothing. Proving, if only to himself, that a man wasn't defined by what he'd lost, but by what he chose to do after losing it. The well went down 3 feet in the first week, then 4, then 5. The moisture increased with each foot, the soil turning from dry and rocky to damp and workable. Cole's weathered face, carved with new lines of effort and pain, broke into the first genuine smile he'd managed since the trial. There was water here. Real water, not just a seep but a spring. Enough to build a life on, however modest that life might be. At 7 feet, the well reached true water, clear and cold, seeping up from an underground spring, just as Billy Carson had predicted. Cole sat on the edge of the hole he dug with his own hands and wept. Not from sadness, but from exhaustion mixed with something like relief, like gratitude, like hope resurrected from ashes. The water was real. He'd found it. He'd built something that worked. He fashioned a crude windlass from dead Palo Verde wood and some rope he'd salvaged from Copper's saddlebag, and suddenly he had access to more water than he could use, more than he'd need to survive. With reliable water, everything changed. The impossible became possible. Survival became building. Building became a future he hadn't dared imagine. With the well complete, Cole moved his camp closer to the water source and began working on more permanent shelter. The adobe ruins gave him a foundation to build from, literally. The old stones had been quarried and shaped with care by whoever had been here before, and Cole treated them with respect, cleaning away decades of accumulated sand and incorporating them into his new walls, like honoring the efforts of those who'd tried and failed before him. He made adobe bricks using mud from the well area, mixed with dried grass he'd gathered from a mile radius around his camp and left to bake in the relentless sun. The work was meditative, each brick a small act of creation, each one placed with deliberation and care. He worked from dawn until the heat became too brutal, then rested in the shade until evening brought cooler temperatures that allowed him to work again. Miguel would have laughed to see the great Cole Hawthorne down on his knees in the mud, making bricks like a common laborer, his hands covered in clay and his clothes stiff with dried dirt. But there was no one to see, and that was precisely the point. Out here, Cole wasn't the wealthy rancher or the disgraced defendant or anyone's employer or anyone's failure. He was just a man, with dirt under his fingernails and a growing wall that would keep the wind out come winter. The structure took shape slowly over weeks of steady labor, a single room about 12 by 12 feet, with thick adobe walls that would stay cool in summer and retain warmth in winter. He salvaged wood from dead trees for roof beams, spanning them across the walls and covering them with layers of smaller branches, then mud, and finally sand. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, and most importantly, it was his in a way nothing had been his since the ranch was seized. During the construction, other travelers found him. The desert wasn't as empty as Cole had initially thought. There were people out there, moving through the wasteland for their own reasons, following their own desperate or hopeful paths. Some were running from something like Billy Carson had been. Others were looking for something they probably wouldn't find. Gold, land, opportunity, redemption. A few were simply wanderers who preferred the harsh honesty of the desert to the comfortable lies of civilization. An old Mexican woman named Rosa stopped one evening, leading a burro loaded with supplies. She was a curandera, a healer, traveling between remote settlements and Indian camps, bringing medicine and wisdom to people who had no access to proper doctors or hospitals. She looked at Cole's building project with approval, her dark eyes taking in the careful work, the solid walls, the sensible design. "This is good work," she said in Spanish. Cole's Spanish was rusty, but serviceable from years of working with Mexican ranch hands, enough to understand and be understood. "Thank you. It keeps me busy, keeps me from thinking too much. A man needs purpose." You found yours again, I think. That's good. That's very good. She stayed 2 days, paying for her water and shelter with herbs and a salve for the persistent blisters on Cole's hands that had become infected despite his best efforts. The salve worked better than anything he'd tried, drawing out the poison and allowing the wounds to finally begin healing. The herbs, when brewed as tea, helped him sleep without the nightmares that had plagued him since the shooting. Dreams of Danny Foster's face and the 2 men falling and Margaret asking him why he'd thrown everything away. "You carry too much guilt," Rosa observed one evening as they sat by his fire. "The desert cooling rapidly after sunset. I see it in your eyes, in the way you move. You're weighted down with something heavy. 2 men died because of choices I made. A young man will never walk again. Did you kill them yourself? Did you shoot the boy?" "I might as well have." "If I'd just let the water go, if I'd just walked away," Rosa shook her head firmly. "No, you fought to protect what was yours, what you'd built over a lifetime. They chose to draw weapons. They chose violence. Those were their choices, not yours. The weight you carry belongs to the man who forced that confrontation, not to you. Doesn't feel that way when I close my eyes at night. Guilt rarely cares about truth, Senor. It prefers the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives that confirm our worst fears about who we are." She poured more tea, the steam rising in the cool desert evening, fragrant with herbs Cole couldn't identify. "But guilt is also a choice. You can carry it forever, or you can set it down and do something useful instead. The men are dead. The boy is injured. Nothing you do can change that. But you can choose whether their suffering is the end of your story or the beginning of a different one." After Rosa left, headed south toward the Mexican settlements she served, Cole thought about her words for days. Doing something useful that seemed within his grasp now. The building was useful. The well was useful. Maybe there were other useful things he could create out here. The ways to turn his exile into something that mattered beyond his own survival. He started a garden. It seemed absurd at first, trying to grow food in the desert where nothing grew without a fight. But Cole remembered reading about the old mission gardens, how the Spanish priests had coaxed crops from seemingly impossible soil through careful irrigation and stubborn determination and something like faith. He had water now, more than he needed. He had time, nothing but time. What he needed was soil that could actually support life. The desert floor around his shelter was mostly sand and caliche, hard-packed and nutrient-poor, good for almost nothing. But in the washes where flash floods sometimes ran during rare rains, there were deposits of darker soil, washed down from the mountains, soil that had some substance to it. Cole spent a week hauling this soil in his saddlebags, making dozens of trips, mixing it with his sandy ground, adding ash from his fires and what little manure copper provided. He dug irrigation channels from his well, careful channels that used gravity to bring water where he needed it without wasting a drop. He had no seeds at first, so he planted the wild things he found: desert willow cuttings, mesquite beans, the bulbs of edible lilies that grew near seasonal pools. He transplanted barrel cactus, carefully and painfully, their spines leaving his hands bloody, but the plants worth the effort for their fruit. It was a strange garden, more native plant preserve than traditional crops, but it grew. That was the miracle. It actually grew. The transformation happened gradually. Green appeared where there had been only brown and grey, actual color in this monochrome landscape. Birds began stopping at his well for water, and with the birds came insects, and with the insects came small lizards, and slowly, impossibly, life concentrated around the tiny oasis Cole was creating from nothing but determination and water, and the refusal to give up. A prospector named Dutch Patterson arrived in early November, leading 2 pack mules loaded with mining equipment. He was 70 if he was a day, with a white beard stained yellow from tobacco and eyes that had seen too many dreams fail, but still held on to hope somehow. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch said, surveying Cole's work with genuine amazement. "Somebody's gone and put down roots in hell itself. Never thought I'd see anything like this out here." Seemed like a good idea at the time. Not sure if I was right about that, Dutch laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. Mind if I water my animals? I'll pay for the privilege, of course. Water's free for anyone who needs it. Always will be. Free water. Now that's something you don't hear often. Not in this country. Dutch led his mules to the well and let them drink their fill, the animals making grateful sounds as they satisfied their thirst. I knew a Cole Hawthorne once. Big rancher up near Mesquite Flats, built himself quite an empire. You related? Distantly, Cole lied, not ready to discuss who he'd been or what he'd lost. That life seemed to belong to someone else now. Dutch stayed 3 days, working on a busted saddle and reshaping his mule's hooves with tools from Cole's growing workshop. In exchange, he gave Cole a leather pouch of vegetable seeds, squash, beans, corn that he'd been carrying for years with some vague idea of planting them when he struck it rich and settled down. Never did find that bonanza, Dutch admitted on his last evening, his voice carrying decades of disappointment. Had been looking 40 years, following every rumor and half-reliable map. Figure I'm not going to find it now at my age. These seeds should go to someone who'll actually use them, someone who's building something real instead of chasing phantoms. Cole planted the seeds in his best soil, watering them carefully, talking to them the way Margaret used to talk to her flowers back at the ranch, whispering encouragement like they could hear and respond. It seemed foolish, but somehow it also seemed right, seemed like honoring her memory in a way that mattered. The seeds sprouted within a week, tiny green shoots that felt like a minor miracle in the middle of all this harshness. Cole found himself checking on them multiple times a day, protecting them from foraging animals, adjusting the irrigation to give them exactly what they needed. By December, Cole's shelter was complete, and his garden was actually producing small amounts of food, not much, but enough that he wasn't entirely dependent on rabbit meat and whatever else he could catch or scavenge. He'd built a covered area for Copper, fashioned a workspace where he could repair tack and make tools, and even created a small ramada, a shade structure, made from mesquite posts and desert willow branches, where he could sit during the hottest parts of the day and watch the garden grow. The place had started to feel less like a survival camp and more like a home, something he'd built with his own hands that couldn't be taken away by corrupt judges or ambitious rivals. 2 young men arrived on a cold December afternoon, brothers by the look of them, both thin and desperate looking. They rode horses that were nearly used up, ribs showing, heads hanging low. The brothers carried themselves with the careful alertness of people expecting trouble to find them at any moment. Looking for water, the older one said. His voice was wary, his hand near his gun, ready for betrayal or attack. You found it. Help yourselves. There's plenty. They didn't move immediately, as if expecting a trap, some condition that would be revealed once they'd lowered their guard. Cole understood that wariness. Trust was a rare commodity out here, and these boys had probably learned that lesson the hard way. I'm not going to hurt you, Cole said gently, keeping his hands visible and away from any weapons. Water's free. If you're hungry, I've got some beans cooking. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your stomachs and give you strength for wherever you're going. The younger brother, he couldn't have been more than 16, suddenly swayed in his saddle. The older one grabbed his arm quickly. Sam's been sick. Fever for 3 days now. I've been trying to get him to a doctor, but the nearest town is still 2 days away, and I'm not sure he'll make it. Cole was at the boy's side immediately, his old rancher's instincts taking over. He'd dealt with sick ranch hands plenty of times, knew the signs of serious trouble. The boy was burning up, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes glassy and unfocused with fever. Get him down carefully. I've got a bed inside where he can rest properly. You have any idea what caused the fever? Cut on his leg went bad. Real bad. They carried Sam into Cole's shelter and laid him on the bed, a simple frame with rope stringing and a thin mattress filled with dried grass that Cole had gathered and stuffed into an old grain sack. Cole examined the leg wound and felt his stomach drop. It was infected, badly infected, red lines spreading from the cut up toward the boy's groin. Blood poisoning. Without proper treatment, Without antibiotics that probably didn't exist out here in the middle of nowhere, the boy would likely die within days, maybe sooner. Cole remembered Rosa's herbs, the ones she'd left with him, along with some basic instructions. She'd explained what each one did, though he'd paid only partial attention at the time, not imagining he'd need the knowledge so soon. Now he wished he'd listened more carefully, written things down, asked more questions, but he had some knowledge, gained from years of treating injured animals and the occasional sick ranch hand far from town and professional medical care. He'd have to trust that and hope it was enough. He cleaned the wound with water boiled over his fire, the boy screaming despite his weakened state, the older brother having to hold him down. Then Cole applied a poultice made from herbs Rosa had left, something with sage and another plant he couldn't identify, but remembered Rosa saying it drew out poison. He covered it with clean cloth, torn from one of his spare shirts, then brewed a tea from willow bark for the fever and made sure Sam drank water regularly, forcing it down his throat when necessary. The older brother, whose name was Jack, watched with a mixture of hope and fear written across his young face. "Why are you helping us? You don't know us. We could be outlaws for all you know, because that's what people do, or should do anyway. Out here, we're all just trying to survive. Seems wrong not to help when I can." Most wouldn't, not for strangers, not for people who can't pay. Cole thought about that while he worked, thought about the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. A year ago, he might have agreed with Jack's assessment. He'd become insulated in his prosperity, dealing with people through layers of formality and business transaction, through contracts and wages and careful negotiations. But the desert had stripped away those layers, and what remained was simpler and possibly more honest. Just one human being helping another because that's what humans were supposed to do for each other. Out here, there's no such thing as strangers, Cole said. Just people trying to survive. We help each other, or we all die alone. That's the only rule that matters. Sam's fever broke on the third day, a good sign that meant his body was winning the fight against infection. By the fifth day, he was sitting up and eating beans, asking questions and actually smiling. By the seventh day, both brothers were working alongside Cole, helping to expand his garden and improve his irrigation channels, insisting on paying back his kindness with labor since they had no money. They had construction skills their father had taught them before he died in a mining accident back in Colorado, and they helped Cole build a second shelter, smaller than his main one, but adequate for guests who might need a place to stay. A recognition that Cole's isolated camp was becoming something more than just one man's refuge. When they left 2 weeks later, headed for California and the fresh start they hoped to find there, Jack shook Cole's hand with genuine warmth and gratitude. "I don't know what you're building out here, Mr. Hawthorne, but it's something good, something important. My brother would be dead if not for you, and you didn't ask for anything in return. That's rare in this world. That's precious. Just a place to grow some vegetables and catch some rain," Cole replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's more than that," Jack said seriously. "It's hope, and that's scarcer than water in these parts. You're giving people hope just by being here, just by surviving and building something real. Don't underestimate what that means." After they left, Cole thought about those words, hope. He hadn't been trying to create hope, had been focused on simple survival and maybe punishing himself for what had happened. But maybe hope was a side effect of refusing to give up, of building something even when everything seemed lost. Maybe hope was what happened when you kept working even when it seemed pointless. Winter deepened, bringing cold nights that made Cole grateful for his solid shelter and the warmth Copper provided in the attached stable. He spent his evenings by the fire, wrapped in blankets, listening to coyotes sing their ancient songs and watching stars wheel across a sky unpolluted by city lights. Winter in the desert brought its own stark beauty along with the hardships. The days were mild, sometimes even pleasant, but the nights cut like broken glass, temperatures dropping below freezing for hours at a stretch. Cole spent his evenings by the fire, wrapped in blankets he'd traded for with a passing family, listening to coyotes sing their ancient songs and watching stars wheel across a sky unpolluted by city lights. He'd never noticed how many stars there were when you got away from settlements and their lamps. Out here, the Milky Way looked like a river of light flowing across the heavens, beautiful and eternal and utterly indifferent to human concerns. He thought about his old life during those quiet nights, but not with longing exactly, more with a kind of detached curiosity, as if remembering someone else's story, a character in a book he'd read long ago. The ranch, the business meetings, the careful maneuvering of money and influence, it all seemed strangely hollow now when he examined it honestly. He'd been successful, certainly, wealthy by any reasonable measure, respected throughout the territory. But had he been happy? Had he found meaning in any of it, beyond the accumulation itself? Margaret would have known the answer. She'd seen through his driven nature, understood that his relentless building and expanding came from some deep insecurity, a fear that if he stopped moving forward even for a moment, he'd slide backward into the poverty of his youth. She tried to slow him down, to make him appreciate what they already had, rather than always reaching for more. Always planning the next acquisition or expansion. Cole, she'd said once, a few years before she died, sitting on that wraparound porch while he pored over account books, we have enough. More than enough. When do you stop and just enjoy it? When do we actually live instead of always preparing to live? Soon, he'd promised, without looking up from his ledgers. Just a few more years to build the reserves, make sure we're secure no matter what happens. But those few years had turned into more years. And then she was gone, taken by a fever that came on fast and killed faster. And he'd never taken the time to simply sit with her and appreciate what they'd built together. He'd been too busy adding more land, more cattle, more everything, as if quantity could somehow fill the emptiness he didn't want to acknowledge. The desert had a way of clarifying such thoughts, stripping away the excuses and rationalizations. Out here, with nothing but essentials, Cole understood what Margaret had been trying to tell him all those years. Enough was a real place you could reach, not a constantly receding horizon that moved away no matter how fast you chased it. He had enough now, water, shelter, food he grew himself, and the peace of being responsible only for his own survival. No employees depending on him for their livelihoods, no son disappointed in his choices, no community judging his every decision. A man could live quite well on enough, he discovered. Better, maybe, than living with too much and the constant fear of losing it. Spring brought wildflowers, incredible displays of orange poppies, purple lupine, and yellow brittlebush that transformed the desert overnight after rare winter rains. Cole hadn't known such beauty existed in this harsh landscape. He'd ridden through desert country many times during his ranching days, but always with his mind on business, on getting from one place to another as efficiently as possible. He'd never stopped to notice the small miracles happening right at ground level, never paid attention to anything that couldn't be bought or sold or put to practical use. More travelers came through as the weather warmed and the desert became passable again after winter. Some stayed a night, others a few days, a few for weeks, while they recovered from illness or injury or simply exhaustion. Cole noticed a pattern. They were almost always people running from something or searching for something, people who didn't quite fit in the ordered world of towns and cities. Outlaws, yes, but also dreamers, wanderers, those who'd made mistakes and were trying to start over, those who'd been pushed out by circumstances or choices and had nowhere else to go. Cole welcomed them all with the same simple hospitality. Water from his well, a place to rest in the shade, food if he had extra to share. He didn't ask questions about their pasts unless they volunteered information, didn't judge their choices or their circumstances. The man who'd lost everything had no business judging others for their losses or their struggles. A woman named Ellen arrived in April, riding side saddle on a horse that had clearly been expensive once, but was now worn and travel-stained. She was perhaps 40, dressed in clothes that had seen better days, but had been quality to begin with. She carried herself with dignity, despite obvious exhaustion and worry. "I'm looking for my brother," she said after watering her horse and accepting a cup of water for herself. "He headed into the desert 6 months ago. Haven't heard from him since. I'm terrified he's dead. What's his name? Maybe I've seen him pass through." "Martin Prescott. He's a writer, or was trying to be. Thought the desert would give him inspiration or clarity or something profound to write about. I thought it would kill him, but my husband said to let him go, said Martin needed to work things out on his own. But 6 months is too long without word, too long for a man who's never spent more than a night under the stars in his entire life." Cole considered carefully. "Haven't seen anyone by that name, but I haven't been here that long myself." "Where exactly did he say he was going?" "He didn't. Just rode south from Tucson with a pack mule and 6 months of supplies, heading into the emptiest country on the map. That was Martin, always dramatic, always looking for some grand experience to write about." Her voice caught. "I should have stopped him. Should have done something." Ellen stayed 4 days, helping with the garden in exchange for room and board, scanning the horizon, hopefully each morning as the sun rose, her face falling slightly each time no rider appeared. On the 4th day, a lone rider appeared from the south, a thin man with a sun-damaged face, wearing clothes that had been expensive once, but were now little more than rags, with a notebook sticking out of his saddlebag. "Martin!" Ellen's cry cut across the quiet desert morning. The reunion was touching in its restraint. These were people who'd been raised not to show excessive emotion in public, but their embrace lasted long enough to tell the real story of relief and love and fear finally releasing its grip. Martin looked weathered, but somehow more solid than his sister, as if the desert had pared away everything soft and unnecessary and left something essential and real. "I'm sorry I worried you, Ellen. I got caught up in the work and lost track of time completely. Out here, days blur together in a way they never do in civilization. 6 months, Martin. 6 months without a single word. I thought you were dead. Mother thought you were dead. Do you have any idea what that did to us? I know, I'm sorry. But I found what I needed to find out here. I found my voice, found stories worth telling. Look." He pulled out the notebook, pages covered in cramped handwriting. "I've written more in these 6 months than in the previous 6 years. The desert has a way of stripping away all the nonsense and leaving only what's real." They stayed another 2 days, Martin showing genuine interest in what Cole had built, asking questions about the well and the garden and the construction techniques. "This is remarkable," he said, examining the adobe walls and the irrigation system. "You've created an oasis from absolutely nothing, turned one of the harshest environments on Earth into something that can sustain life. Not from nothing. From work and water and some luck, and help from people passing through. Still, it takes vision to see what's possible in a place like this." Martin gestured at the neat rows of vegetables, the fruit trees Cole had planted from seeds and cuttings, the chickens he'd traded for from a Mexican family passing through a month earlier. Most people look at the desert and see only what's missing: water, shelter, food, civilization. You saw what could be added, what could be built. That's the mark of someone who understands creation at a fundamental level. The observation struck Cole as more profound than Martin probably intended. His whole life before the fall had been about accumulation, adding land, adding cattle, adding wealth-like items in a ledger. But here he was adding something different, not possessions but possibility, not wealth but life itself. Each plant he coaxed from the soil, each improvement he made to the property, each traveler he helped, added something to a different kind of account. Not money in a bank, not property recorded in a deed, but something he couldn't quite name. Purpose, maybe, or meaning, or simply the satisfaction of building something that helped others. After Ellen and Martin left, together, her mission accomplished, his inspiration gathered, Cole found himself thinking about the future for the first time in months. What was he building here, really? A hermitage where one old man could hide from his failures? A way station for desperate travelers? Something else entirely, something he hadn't consciously planned but was emerging anyway. The answer came not from thinking, but from observing, from watching what was actually happening rather than what he'd intended. He simply kept working, kept improving, kept welcoming whoever showed up needing help. The pattern established itself organically, without conscious planning or formal organization. His place became known among desert travelers as a safe haven, a spot where you could get water without payment, rest without judgment, sometimes food if supplies allowed, and always a measure of respect, regardless of who you were or where you'd come from. By summer, Cole had expanded the garden significantly, using techniques he remembered from his youth and new ones he'd learned from passing travelers. He'd also built a third shelter, this one larger, designed as a communal space where multiple travelers could stay simultaneously without crowding. He added a forge using stone from the ruins and scrap metal he'd accumulated, giving him the ability to repair tools and shoes for horses and mules. He constructed a better chicken coop from salvaged wood and wire, and traded work and vegetables for a milk goat from a passing family, providing a source of milk and cheese that improved everyone's nutrition. Each improvement felt right, in a way his ranch expansions never had. Back then, he'd been building an empire, something to impress others and prove his worth to himself and the world. Here he was building something that served immediate practical needs without any thought to prestige or profit. The goal wasn't wealth or status, but simply making life a little easier for whoever happened to be passing through this harsh country. A young couple arrived in late June, newlyweds by the look of them, heading west with dreams of California and the opportunities they'd heard awaited there. They were city people, completely unprepared for desert travel, carrying far too little water and far too many impractical possessions. Their supplies were nearly exhausted, and they'd badly underestimated how much water they'd need to cross this seemingly empty expanse. "We thought the desert was just a day's ride," the young man said, shame and embarrassment coloring his face. "The maps made it look close, like we could cross it in an afternoon." "Maps lie about distance out here," Cole replied without judgment. "What looks like an inch on paper can be 40 miles of the hardest country you'll ever cross, with the sun beating down and no water between you and death." He resupplied them from his own stores, showing them how to recognize water signs in the landscape, explaining which plants were edible and which would kill them within hours, teaching them the basics of desert survival they should have learned before starting this journey. He made them stay 3 days, letting them rest and recover their strength and actually learn the lessons that might keep them alive once they left his protection. When they were ready to leave, supplies replenished and knowledge gained, the young woman asked the question Cole had been expecting. "How much do we owe you? We have some money, not much, but we can pay something." "Nothing. You owe me nothing. Just pass it forward when you're able." "Pass it forward? Help the next person who needs it, whenever you're in a position to help. That's payment enough for anything I've done." These small interactions gave Cole something he hadn't expected to find in exile: connection without obligation. He wasn't responsible for these people's lives the way he'd been responsible for his ranch hands and their families back when he'd been an employer. He wasn't their leader or their savior or their judge. He was simply someone who helped when help was needed, then let them continue their journeys. The lack of ongoing obligation felt freeing in a way his old life never had, unburdened by the weight of people depending on him for their very survival. Miguel found him in August, riding into camp on a horse Cole recognized from the ranch. Cole was working on a new irrigation channel, digging in the full heat of midday because the work needed doing, and he'd learned to endure what needed to be endured. He heard hoofbeats and looked up to see his old foreman approaching, and the sight hit Cole harder than he'd expected. Miguel represented everything he'd lost, everyone he'd failed, the entire life that had crumbled around him. For a moment, Cole considered hiding, avoiding this confrontation with his past and everything it represented. But he'd built something here, something honest and real, and hiding from it would be a betrayal of that honesty. So he stood, dirty and sweating and old, and waited for his former friend to reach him. Miguel dismounted and simply stared for a Long moment, taking in the transformed landscape. The buildings solid and well built, the garden green and productive, the chickens scratching contentedly in their coop, the whole impossible oasis that Cole had created from nothing but determination. And water and refusal to give up. Santa Maria, Miguel finally said, genuine awe in his voice. We thought you were dead, Cole. Everyone back in Mesquite Flats assumed the desert had claimed you months ago. But this, he gestured at everything Cole had built. This is incredible. I survived. That's about all there is to it. This is more than survival. This is, I don't even know what to call it. A miracle, maybe. What brings me out here? You, obviously. Took me months to track you down, following rumors and half-stories. Tales of a crazy old man living in the desert and building something in the middle of nowhere. Should have known it was you from the description. Only Cole Hawthorne would be stubborn enough to make the desert bloom, where nothing has grown for 1,000 years. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, years of friendship competing with, months of separation and everything that had happened between then and now. Then Miguel pulled something from his saddlebag, a piece of wood, carved and silver inlaid, immediately recognizable. It was the music stand from Margaret's piano, the piece with her initials engraved in flowing script. Blackwood's men were burning everything when they took possession, Miguel explained. Selling what they could, destroying the rest like vandals. I saved what I could, which wasn't much. But I thought you might want this, if you were still alive. I've been carrying it for months, hoping I'd find you. Cole took the piece of piano, feeling the smooth wood worn by Margaret's hands, the careful craftsmanship that had made it beautiful. Tears threatened, but he pushed them down, not ready to break in front of Miguel, not after maintaining his composure for so long. Thank you, Miguel. That means more than you know, more than I can say. There's something else you should know. Miguel's face grew serious. People are talking about what happened, really talking now. The truth is coming out. Witnesses who were afraid to speak up during the trial are finding their courage now. There's talk of reopening the case, of investigating the judge and Blackwood's involvement. People are finally seeing the whole thing for the corrupt sham it was. No. Cole's response was immediate and firm, leaving no room for discussion. No, Cole, this could change everything. I'm done with that life, Miguel. Done with courts. And lawyers and fighting over land and water and who said what to whom. Let Blackwood have it all. I don't want it back. I don't want any of it. Miguel looked at him as if he'd lost his mind, as if exile had driven him to some kind of madness. Cole, that ranch was your life's work. 40 years of your life went into building that place. 40 years building something that could be taken away in an afternoon by a corrupt judge and a greedy rival. Cole interrupted. I'm building something different now, something that can't be seized by any court or stolen by any man with better lawyers. This place, he gestured at his modest settlement, this can't be taken from me because I don't own it. It's just here, helping whoever needs help. That's worth more than any ranch ever was. What about legacy? What about everything you worked for? That ranch was supposed to be something that lasted, something you could pass down to Thomas. Thomas wants nothing to do with ranching or with me. And the ranch dies with me either way, with or without my name on the deed. At least this, Cole gestured at the settlement again, this is built on principles that can outlast any one person. It doesn't need me, specifically. It just needs people willing to help each other, willing to share what they have. That's a legacy that might actually last. Miguel sat heavily on a bench Cole had built under the Ramada, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. The ride had been hard, but the conversation seemed harder. You've changed, old friend. The Cole Hawthorne I knew would never have walked away from his life's work, would have fought to his last breath to reclaim what was his. You're right, I have changed. The desert taught me things I needed to learn, painful things I resisted for as long as I could. About what matters and what doesn't, about what lasts and what's just illusion, about what truly makes a life worth living. I'm grateful for those lessons, even though they came hard and cost me everything I thought defined me. And you're happy. Here, Truly, living like this, with nothing, starting over at your age? Cole considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. I'm at peace. That's better than happy. Happy is fleeting, dependent on circumstances that change constantly. Peace endures even when circumstances are hard. I have peace here in a way I never had at the ranch, not even in the best years. They talked long into the evening, old friends bridging the gap between who Cole had been and who he was becoming. Between the past, neither could change, and the future only one of them was building. Miguel eventually accepted, if not fully understood, Cole's choice. Before he left the next morning, he gripped Cole's shoulder in the old, familiar way. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. The door's always open, whatever that means now. I do. But Miguel, I won't change my mind. This is where I belong now. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I can feel it in a way I never felt anything at the ranch. After Miguel left, heading back north toward everything Cole had left behind, Cole felt a sense of closure settling over him like a blessing. The door to his old life was officially closed now, and he had no regrets about shutting it. Whatever came next would be built on this new foundation, this simpler and somehow truer way of living. The settlement continued to grow organically through summer and into fall. A family of homesteaders stopped in September with a wagon broken beyond their ability to repair, a wheel completely shattered, the axle cracked, the whole thing looking like it might never roll again. The husband had carpentry skills but no tools to work with. Cole helped him fix the wagon, using the forge and his growing collection of implements, working together for 3 long days until the repair was solid and reliable. In gratitude, the carpenter spent 3 additional days helping Cole build a proper barn for Copper and the other animals that had accumulated over the months. 2 more goats now, a dozen chickens, and a burrow someone had abandoned when it grew too old to work. You need a better workshop, the carpenter observed as they worked, his professional eye noting inefficiencies and opportunities. That forge is good for what it is, but you need covered space to work in during bad weather, and proper storage for tools and materials. What you've got now is adequate, but it could be so much better with just a little planning. Together, they designed and built a workshop, a long, low building with a roof that extended well beyond the walls to create shaded work areas on all sides. It wasn't fancy or sophisticated, but it was functional and well built, and it dramatically improved Cole's ability to help travelers with broken equipment, worn-out tools, and the 1,000 small repairs that desert travel demanded. Word continued to spread through the mysterious traveler network that existed in the desert, carried by people who stopped and were helped and told others about their experience. Cole's settlement, he didn't have a name for it, didn't want to name it like it belonged to him, became a known waypoint on several desert routes. Mexican families traveling north to find work, prospectors heading to distant claims, settlers moving west toward California and their dreams, even the occasional outlaw running from the law and past mistakes. They all knew about the man in the desert who offered help without judgment or conditions. Some people left things in exchange for his hospitality, unable to simply take without giving something back. A set of medical supplies from a traveling doctor who'd stopped to rest his horses. Seeds from a farmer who'd had a good harvest and could spare some for next year's planting. A used but serviceable rifle from a man who was giving up prospecting and heading back to civilization. A box of books from a teacher relocating to California and unable to carry everything. These items accumulated slowly, and Cole found uses for all of them, incorporating them into the life and function of his growing settlement. The medical supplies proved their worth when a man arrived with a badly infected snakebite in late October. Cole wasn't a doctor, had never claimed to be, but he'd learned basic medicine from necessity over the years and from careful observation. He cleaned and drained the wound, applied proper dressings using the supplies the traveling doctor had left, and kept the man hydrated and still until the worst of the crisis passed. The man lived, though he lost 2 fingers to the infection. The flesh too far gone to save, "You saved my life," the man said before he left a week later. His hand bandaged, but his fever broken and his color returning. "I know what I am, what I've done. I'm a wanted man, in case you couldn't tell from the way I keep watching the horizon. But you didn't ask my name, and you didn't care about my past. You just helped. That's rare in this world, rarer than gold or water or anything else valuable." After the man left, riding south toward Mexico and whatever future awaited him there, Cole thought about that conversation for days. He hadn't asked the man's name or his crimes, because it didn't matter, not really. Out here, everyone was running from something or toward something. The past was less important than the present moment, and the present moment had required treating a snakebite, not conducting moral inventory or passing judgment on choices already made and unchangeable. This non-judgmental approach attracted people who had nowhere else to go, people who'd been rejected or abandoned or condemned by the world they'd left behind. A young woman fleeing an arranged marriage, her face still bearing the bruises her father had given her when she refused. A former soldier who couldn't adjust to civilian life after the horrors he'd seen and participated in. An old prospector dying of consumption who wanted his last days spent under open sky rather than in a city hospital bed, surrounded by strangers. They came, stayed as long as they needed, and most eventually left when they were ready. Some didn't leave. A man named Samuel arrived in October, the former soldier, and something about Cole's settlement spoke to him in a way nothing else had since he'd returned from war. He had skills with stone and mortar, and helped Cole improve the buildings, adding details and refinements that made them more comfortable and weather-resistant. He didn't talk much about where he'd been or what he'd done during the war, but he worked hard and asked nothing in return except a place to sleep and food to eat, and the peace that seemed to exist here in the middle of nowhere. "You planning to stay permanent?" Cole asked one evening after they'd worked together all day, reinforcing one of the shelters. Samuel considered the question carefully, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "If you'll have me, I think I will. I don't have anywhere else to be, and this place feels right in a way nothing has since before the war. First place I've been where I can sleep without nightmares, where I can work without feeling like everything's pointless. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense. You're welcome to stay as long as you like." Could use the help, truth be told. This place is getting bigger than one man can manage alone. Having Samuel around changed things in subtle but important ways. It wasn't just Cole anymore, one man maintaining a desert outpost in isolation. It was two men working together, building something larger than either could manage alone. They worked well together, finding a rhythm that didn't require much conversation, each understanding without being told what needed doing next. Samuel understood implicitly that this wasn't about giving orders or following them, about hierarchy or control. It was about seeing what needed doing and doing it, about contributing to something that mattered. By late November, the settlement had evolved significantly from Cole's original survival camp. There were now 5 structures: Cole's original shelter, the communal sleeping area, the workshop, the barn, and a new building Samuel had designed specifically for food storage, with thick walls and a clever design that kept the interior cool even in summer heat, extending the life of their stored provisions significantly. The garden had expanded to nearly an acre, producing enough food that Cole could trade surplus for supplies he couldn't make himself: salt, flour, coffee, things that made life more bearable. A Mexican family who passed through regularly began bringing seeds and young fruit trees, exchanging them for vegetables and the use of Cole's well. This informal trading network developed naturally, without contracts or formal agreements. People helped each other because helping each other made practical sense and felt right. Cole was working on the irrigation system one December morning when he heard multiple horses approaching. He straightened, wiping sweat from his face, and watched as 5 riders appeared on the horizon. They wore badges, territorial law officers. His first instinct was the old fear, the expectation of arrest or accusation, but he suppressed it. He'd done nothing wrong out here. The past was the past, and whatever they wanted, he'd face it standing up. The lead officer dismounted, a man in his 40s with hard eyes and a harder reputation. Cole recognized him. Jack Morrison, the territorial marshal who'd arrested him after the shooting. His stomach tightened with old anger and newer wariness. Cole Hawthorne. Thought you might be dead by now, swallowed up by this desert like it swallows most people stupid enough to try living in it. Not yet. What brings law officers out to the middle of nowhere? Looking for someone. Man robbed a bank in Tucson 2 weeks back. Tracks lead this direction. Morrison looked around at the settlement, surprise and something like respect showing on his weathered face, despite his attempt to maintain official sternness. What the hell is all this? You've built a whole town out here. A place to get water and rest. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing more? Morrison walked through the settlement, examining everything with a lawman's naturally suspicious eye, looking for violations or hidden crimes. You've built proper structures, got gardens growing, livestock, everything. Who else is living here? You harboring fugitives? Samuel appeared from the workshop at that moment, and Morrison's hand went instinctively to his gun. Easy, Cole said quickly, stepping between them. That's Samuel. He helps maintain the place. He's not your bank robber, I can promise you that. How do you know? You running a hideout for outlaws, Hawthorne? That would be just like you, thumbing your nose at the law that wronged you by helping criminals avoid justice. The accusation stung, but Cole kept his voice level and calm. I'm running a way station for anyone who needs it. People come through, they get water, maybe some food, a place to rest and recover their strength. Then they move on. I don't ask questions about where they've been or where they're going. I don't judge their pasts or their choices. I just help however I can. That's mighty convenient for criminals running from justice. It's also convenient for families traveling west, prospectors looking for claims, and law officers who might need water and rest in the middle of the desert. Cole met Morrison's eyes steadily, without fear or defiance, just honest directness. You're welcome to water your horses and refill your canteens. Free of charge like everyone else. I don't play favorites, and I don't discriminate based on badges or their absence. Morrison studied him for a long moment. Some kind of internal calculation happening behind those hard eyes. Then he nodded slowly. Appreciate the offer. We've been riding hard for 3 days. Water would be good. He gestured to his men, who dismounted gratefully and led their horses to the well. While the horses drank deeply, Morrison walked around more carefully, this time with less suspicion and more genuine curiosity. You really built all this yourself? From nothing? Had help. People passing through lend a hand sometimes, leave supplies, share knowledge. It's been a group effort more than a solo achievement. It's impressive. More than impressive. It's damn near miraculous what you've accomplished out here. Morrison paused by the garden, looking at the neat rows of winter vegetables still producing in the mild desert winter. You know people are talking about you back in Mesquite Flats, right? I imagine they are. Small towns love their gossip. Not the way you think. Well, some are still saying you got what you deserved, that justice was served. But others are starting to question what happened at that trial. Blackwood's made some enemies since taking over your ranch. Made some mistakes that people are noticing. Folks are remembering that you ran a good operation for 40 years without any trouble until he showed up with his Eastern money and his political connections. Cole didn't respond immediately, didn't trust himself to speak without emotion showing through. He didn't want to have this conversation, didn't want to think about reclaiming anything from his old life. Morrison seemed to understand Cole's silence. I'm not saying the law is ready to reverse your conviction or anything like that. But I am saying there are people back there who'd listen if you wanted to tell your side of things again. Now that some time has passed and Blackwood's true nature is becoming clear, I'm not interested in telling my side again. I'm interested in keeping this place running and helping whoever needs help. That's all. The past is done, and I've made my peace with it. Fair enough. You can say I understand giving up everything you built, but I respect the choice. Morrison finished his water and moved to mount his horse, his men following his lead. We didn't find any sign of your bank robber here. He probably went west, toward California, where the pickings are easier. But I'll remember this place. Next time I'm out this way on business, I'll stop by again. If that's all right with you, water's always available. You know that now. Everyone's welcome, badges or no badges, after the lawmen left. Riding west on their manhunt, Samuel came to stand beside Cole. That was tense for a minute there. Morrison's a hard man doing a hard job. Can't fault him for being suspicious. Think they'll cause trouble. No, Morrison's honest in his own way. Follows his own code even if I don't always agree with it. He won't bother us unless we give him reason to. Cole returned to working on the irrigation channel, the brief interruption already fading from his mind. Besides, we're not doing anything wrong. Helping people isn't a crime last time I checked. Some people think it is when you're helping the wrong people. Out here, there are no wrong people. Just people who need help. That's the only distinction that matters. Winter settled over the desert with its peculiar combination of harsh nights and mild days. Cole had prepared well. Food stored, shelters reinforced, animals protected. The settlement felt secure in a way his ranch never had, despite all its wealth and size. There were no mortgages here, no business pressures, no social obligations weighing on him. Just the simple rhythm of maintenance and survival, punctuated by the arrival and departure of travelers seeking respite. Christmas came and went unmarked, except for a small celebration with Samuel, who'd carved a wooden angel as a gift, his soldier's hands still capable of delicate work. Cole had nothing to give in return, except a better pair of boots he'd repaired with leather salvaged from an abandoned saddle. But Samuel seemed genuinely pleased with the practical gift. They sat by the fire that evening, drinking coffee brewed from beans a Mexican trader had exchanged for vegetables, and talked about the year past and the year ahead. You ever regret it? Samuel asked quietly, staring into the flames. Giving up your old life, everything you worked for? Cole considered the question carefully, giving it the weight it deserved. I regret how it ended. The violence, the people who got hurt, Danny Foster's legs, the 2 men who died. The way everything fell apart so quickly after 40 years of building. But the life itself, the ranch, the wealth, the status, I don't know. I was successful, sure, respected, wealthy by any reasonable measure, but I'm not certain I was happy. Not the way I am now, anyway. You're happy here? I'm content. Maybe that's better than happy. Happy comes and goes with circumstances. Content stays even when things are hard. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring more work, more travelers, more challenges. But tonight there was peace, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The years that followed brought their rhythms, seasons changing with desert precision, travelers coming and going like migratory birds. The settlement growing slowly but steadily in both size and reputation. Cole aged gracefully into his 70s, his white hair and deeply lined face bearing witness to years of sun and wind and hard living. His eyes remained clear, though, and his hands remained steady enough for the work that needed doing. One spring morning, working in the garden he'd tended for 7 years, Cole felt a familiar pain bloom in his chest, sharp and immediate and unmistakable. He recognized it for what it was, had known this moment would come eventually. His heart, which had carried him through 63 years of hard living and 7 years of desert redemption, was finally giving out. He sat down carefully among the tomato plants he'd been staking, arranged himself against a post so he wouldn't fall when it happened, and waited with the patience the desert had taught him. Sarah found him there 10 minutes later, his granddaughter, who'd arrived 2 years earlier and stayed, finding in the settlement something her comfortable Boston life had lacked, knelt beside him immediately. She took his hand, and Cole saw understanding in her eyes, Margaret's eyes looking at him across the years. Should I get Hannah or Samuel? No point rushing things. This is just how it ends. That's all right. I've had more time than I deserved. Cole looked at his granddaughter, seeing the future in her young face, seeing the continuation of everything he'd built here. You'll keep it going. The settlement, the mission, the principles we've established? We all will. This is bigger than any of us now, grandfather. You made sure of that. You built something that doesn't need you specifically. It needs what you taught us, but it doesn't require you to be here to continue. Good. That's good. That's what I hoped for. Cole felt his breathing becoming labored, but there was no pain now beyond the tightness in his chest, just a gentle fading like a lamp running out of oil. "Tell Samuel thank you. Tell Hannah thank you. Tell them all, I will. But you can tell them yourself. They're coming now, and they were. Samuel running from the workshop, tools forgotten. Hannah hurrying from the main building, flour dusting her hands from morning baking. Jose and the others converging from various corners of the settlement, drawn by some instinct, or perhaps by Sarah's cry when she'd first found him. They gathered around Cole, these people he'd found in the desert and who'd found him in return. His family, more real than blood in many ways, bound by shared purpose and mutual care rather than mere biology. "Don't look so sad," Cole managed, his voice weak, but still carrying the authority of someone who'd lived fully and without major regrets. "This is a good ending. Better than I deserved after everything that happened. Better than I expected when I rode into this desert 7 years ago, expecting to die alone. You deserve this and more," Samuel said, gripping his shoulder with the careful strength of a true friend. "You've earned your peace, Cole. You've more than earned it." Cole shook his head slightly, using what energy remained. "Nobody deserves anything. We just do our best with what we're given and hope it's enough. I think," he paused, gathering strength for what he wanted to say, "I think maybe it was enough. This place, all of you, the people we've helped over the years. Maybe that was enough to balance the scales, or at least to make my life mean something beyond accumulation and loss." Hannah was crying quietly, and Sarah held his hand tighter. More people gathered, travelers who'd been staying at the settlement, permanent residents whose lives Cole had touched, people drawn by the sense that something important was ending. They formed a circle around him, this man who'd built a sanctuary from nothing and asked nothing in return except that people be kind to each other. "Margaret," Cole whispered, his eyes focusing on something the others couldn't see, some presence invisible to younger eyes. "I'm coming, Maggie. I'm finally coming home to you. I found my way back, took the long road, but I found it." His breathing stopped gently, easily, like falling asleep after a long day of good work. Samuel closed his eyes with careful reverence, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke. Then naturally, without discussion or planning, they began to sing, an old hymn that Cole had hummed sometimes while working, one that spoke of rest after labor and peace after storm, and coming home after long wandering. Their voices rose in the desert air, carrying across the settlement and beyond, a farewell to a man who'd lost everything and built something beautiful from the ruins. They buried him beside the piece of Margaret's piano stand, which he'd kept in a place of honor for 7 years, under a simple stone marker. Samuel carved the inscription himself, working late into the night to get it right. Cole Hawthorne, builder, helper, friend. He found sanctuary in the desert and shared it with everyone who needed it. The funeral the next day was attended by more people than anyone expected. Travelers who'd been passing through and heard the news. Former guests who rode for days to pay their respects. People from distant towns who'd heard stories about the settlement and wanted to honor the man who'd created it. Even Miguel came, leading a small group of men from the old ranch, their faces showing genuine grief for a friend and employer they'd respected. "He was a good man," Miguel said simply when it was his turn to speak over the grave. "He made mistakes like we all do, but he owned them, learned from them, and built something better from the ashes. That's all any of us can hope to do in this life." Cole did it better than most. The settlement continued after Cole's death, just as he'd intended and planned for. Sarah and Samuel led it together, with Hannah and Jose providing essential support and wisdom. The principles remained unchanged, carved in stone at the entrance and carried in the hearts of everyone who lived there or passed through. Water was always free. Shelter was always available. Help was always given without judgment or expectation of repayment. The core mission never wavered even as the settlement grew larger over the years. It expanded from a way station to a small town, eventually gaining a proper school where Marcus taught children not just reading and arithmetic, but the values that made Hawthorne's Rest unique. A medical clinic grew from Hannah's herb collection and basic first aid into a proper facility, drawing doctors who wanted to serve rather than simply profit from others' suffering. A church was built without denomination, becoming a gathering place where people of all faiths, or no faith at all, could find community and reflection without judgment. But through all the growth and inevitable changes, the core remained unchanged. The stone at the entrance still proclaimed the settlement's purpose and principles that Cole had written with Samuel's help 7 years earlier. Every newcomer learned the history, how Cole Hawthorne had lost everything to corruption and chose to build something new rather than seeking revenge. How he'd been offered his old life back and refused it, choosing instead to stay with the community he'd created from nothing. Sarah, before she died at age 82, wrote down everything she could remember about her grandfather. Her detailed account became the definitive history of Hawthorne's Rest, read by every child in the school and studied by every newcomer trying to understand what made this place special and worth preserving. She wrote honestly about his flaws, his initial stubbornness, his resistance to sharing leadership, his struggle with guilt over the shooting. She understood that a perfect man couldn't have built what he built. It took someone who'd failed, who'd suffered, who'd lost everything and had to rebuild himself from nothing, to create a place where others could find their own redemption. The settlement expanded carefully over the decades, always mindful of Cole's lesson about enough. They built what was needed, but resisted the constant temptation to keep building just for growth's sake. They accepted donations gratefully, but never became dependent on them, maintaining the self-sufficiency that had been Cole's original vision. They welcomed newcomers warmly, but maintained the principles that made the place worth coming to in the first place. Politicians occasionally visited, wanting to claim association with the famous settlement, to be photographed at the stone marker over Cole's grave. Business people came with proposals to modernize or expand or monetize the settlement's unique reputation. Each time, the community politely but firmly refused. Hawthorne's Rest wasn't about growth for its own sake, about profit margins, about prestige or political advantage. It was about helping people, plain and simple. Adding complexity or commercial interests would corrupt that mission, would betray everything Cole had built. The desert itself seemed to protect the settlement from those who would exploit or change it. When droughts came that dried up other water sources for miles around, the wells Cole had dug kept flowing, fed by springs that seemed inexhaustible. When storms struck with unexpected fury, the adobe buildings he'd taught them to build weathered the assault with minimal damage. When economic panic swept the territory and then the young state, Hawthorne's Rest remained stable because it wasn't built on money or debt or speculation. It was built on water, work, and willingness to help, things that never lost their value regardless of economic conditions. Generations passed like seasons. The original settlers died and were buried beside Cole in the small cemetery that grew slowly on the settlement's eastern edge. Their children and grandchildren took their places, continuing the work, maintaining the principles, helping the endless stream of travelers who still pass through seeking water and rest, and occasionally redemption. The stories evolved and grew over time, as stories always do, taking on mythic qualities while retaining their essential truth. Children grew up hearing about great-grandfather Cole or Old Cole, or simply the founder, depending on their connection to him. They learned how a broken man had come to the desert to die and instead built something that would outlive him by centuries. They learned that redemption was possible even after the worst failures. That building something good was more important than protecting what you already had. That a life measured in help given was richer than any life measured in wealth accumulated. The settlement became a place of pilgrimage for some, a destination rather than just a waypoint. People came from across the southwest and beyond, drawn by stories of a place where everyone was welcome, where help was freely given, where your past didn't matter as much as your willingness to contribute to the common good. Some came seeking inspiration, others seeking refuge, Still others simply seeking to understand how such a place could exist and endure in a world that seemed increasingly harsh and judgmental. What they found was simpler than they expected, and somehow more profound. They found a community built on basic principles that humans had always known but often forgot. Share what you have, help those in need, judge less and understand more, build up rather than tear down. They found that these simple principles, when actually practiced rather than just preached, could create something remarkable and lasting. The lights of Hawthorne's Rest continued to glow year after year, decade after decade, century into century. The well-worn path from the desert to the settlement's entrance was walked by hundreds of thousands of feet. Desperate feet, hopeful feet, tired feet, feet belonging to people who'd lost their way and people who'd found it. Each person who passed through carried away something intangible but valuable, some small piece of the spirit that Cole had built into this place. And many of them planted that spirit elsewhere, creating ripples that spread far beyond the desert. The sun set over the settlement, as it had every evening for more than a century, painting the sky in those same impossible oranges and purples that had amazed Cole on his first night in this harsh, beautiful land. The settlement lights began to glow, warm against the gathering darkness. Beacons for any traveler who needed refuge from the world's judgments and hardships. And somewhere in the space between earth and sky, perhaps Cole Hawthorne smiled, knowing his work was truly done and done well, knowing the circles had closed and the story had found its proper ending. Not an ending of wealth reclaimed or revenge achieved, but something infinitely better, an ending of peace, of purpose, of principles that would echo through generations like a song that never quite fades. The desert had taught him what truly mattered, and he'd built a place where others could learn the same lesson. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything a life could be, a testimony to the truth that one person, no matter how broken, no matter how far they'd fallen, could still choose to build something beautiful and lasting. The choice itself was the victory. The building itself was the redemption. And the legacy, the real legacy, wasn't property or money or even the physical structures that bore his name. It was the simple, profound truth that one man had proven through his life and work, that even in the harshest circumstances, with the simplest means, people could create something that mattered, something that lasted, something that helped. That was Cole Hawthorne's gift to the world, given freely and maintained faithfully by those who understood its value. And that gift, passed from generation to generation, proved to be the truest kind of wealth any person could leave behind, the wealth of having lived a life that made other lives better, simpler, kinder, more hopeful. The desert wind still whispered through Hawthorne's Rest, carrying the scent of flowers that bloomed where once there'd been only dust, singing the endless song of redemption found in the unlikeliest places, built by the most unlikely hands, and that was enough. It was everything.